Alrighty. Good evening, good morning, good day to you wherever you are. I'm Jonathan Albin, and this is the Game Master's Toolbox on NycosRPG. And today we're taking a little bit of a different tack. We're taking some of the other show concepts and trying to merge them together. I'm really trying to find out the best way to share with you the best tools for being able to run games and have a blast with your friends and improve the efficiency of your games, the fun of your games, and the ease with which you can accomplish these things. Turn that way down. All right. So today we're going to be talking about 5 of the tools in the toolbox, and this will be an ongoing series as the other ones that I've been doing until we find one that works perfectly. But today may be a longer form show because I do have a whole lot to cover. We're going to be talking about creative prophecy. We're going to talk about the quantum ogres problem. We're going to talk about dice honesty a bit. We're also going to talk about what I call absolute relativity and the active perception filter. A lot to cover, a lot to go through, but before we do that, I do want to remind you to subscribe to the Twitch channel so you get to watch these every episode without any commercial breaks. And also, if you are on YouTube and watching this, subscribe, give us a thumbs up. You definitely want to click the bell so that you be updated whenever we do a new video. And if you really want to help with our numbers, make sure that you share this with your friends, because this type of show is difficult to find out there, and if a game master and a storyteller wants to be better at his craft, I can definitely help you with that. So we're going to be talking about several different things, and I ran through the list a moment ago. I do want to get to the particulars as soon as I get to my buttons here and make that go away. Alrighty, so we're going to be talking about creative prophecy first. And the concept of creative prophecy is this. Players really dig it when there is a story about what might happen in the future that occurs in a game and that has a payoff, that has a serious, visceral payoff at some point in the future. And creative prophecy is more than just being lucky on what you say might happen. There is actually a bit of a science and a technology to it. We're going to be going over that. We're also going to be going over the idea of the quantum ogre. And if you're not familiar with the quantum ogre problem, the issue is this. A game master works for 4, 5, 10, 12 hours on putting together the materials for an adventure, and it's going to be north of town. He's got it all mapped out, got it all planned out, and the players decide to go south. He's built that entire encounter. He's got nothing for them to the south, so he plucks up his ogre and moves it to the south. Or if they had gone east, the quantum ogre would be there. And the idea is that the ogre is the adventure that he's planned out, and we'll go more into how that works, but that's fundamentally the topic we're going to be covering. The next we're going to talk about is dice honesty, and I can't think of a game master out there who probably hasn't faced this, and that is when people are in a situation where they are rolling dice. There are a great number of dynamics that go into that person's choices, and sometimes there is a compulsion or a desire to win in that moment, and therefore they have a penchant for fudging the dice or adjusting the dice. And so there are ways we can modify and mollify the dice honesty issues and make the games more enjoyable. We're also going to be talking about absolute relativity, and this has everything to do with the intention and the quality of the story that you have developed, and whether or not you can maintain the integrity of the story as the players do things that don't necessarily fit in or mesh with what you have in mind. The next is active perception filters. And this is my recommendations on how you as a game master can do a better job of projecting what it is you're intending to do with the player group without literally dragging their nose through the course, nor making it so that your plot line is absolutely immutable. And so we're going to go into the particulars of that. So before we do that, do remember, if you haven't yet, to follow us on, we're also on all the other platforms. We haven't gotten started doing any of our materials yet for Instagram or Twitch, or I guess they call it X. For Twitch, yes, we're doing it. For Twitter, for X, we haven't done anything yet with that channel, but we do have that stuff coming. So now let's get, I gotta get all my buttons clicked here in the right order, so I'm showing off the wrong stuff right now, so let me get out of there. All right. So we're going to start right here with topic 1, and that is creative prophecy. Now, I'm going to relate a story that happened in-game and how the realization came to me that there is a possibility of reusing this time and again in games by utilizing creative prophecy. So, at a time some iterations ago, I'm trying to think back, I believe it was fifth iteration, my son and his friends were players at the time, and they were in their teens. That tells you how long ago, because he's now 30-something, 35, 38, I don't remember. He was born in 85, I could do the math, but I don't want to. But it was his high school era, and he had several people that were his friends that were playing with us. And we had one of his particular friends by the name of Kyle, who was just a lovely kid. He was a great kid, but he was a little wayward, a little noisy, a little bit of a challenge. And in dealing with Kyle, I had to figure out ways to get him to act in ways that I would have found more acceptable for the kind of persona he was playing. So I presented him with the tale that there was a certain sword he was looking for that he'd been getting clues about all the way up through. He was intending to become a paladin, and he'd heard that his holy sword was going to be available in the near future at a particular location, which was, I guess, in a way, a form of a prophecy, but it was more generally, I had given the clues that he was going to be looking for this item, and therefore the clues led him in that direction. But at a particular point in the story, he had become a little more rambunctious than usual, and therefore I used a seer in a city to provide him with a vision. And in that vision, he was holding aloft this specific sword he had been searching for. And as he held it aloft in pride and showing off its power, he looked around and realized all of the members of his party were on the ground. In today's parlance, it is basically the same vision sort of that was given to Tony Stark by the Scarlet Witch, the idea that he would see a future where all of his friends would be destroyed. And that alternate future, that partial vision, stuck with Kyle. And he knew he was never going to do that. He was convinced that he would develop the skills necessary to become this holy warrior that he was planning to become, and that he would never stumble in such a fashion. Well, now let's fast forward several adventures. The characters are now collectively involving themselves in an action in the Everdark, and are facing off against a fairly large group of drow. And as the fight goes, not by intent, but by conditions of the fight, each of his allies fell. Now, I wasn't keeping track of it per se. I wasn't intending for this to be the point of the vision at all. It just happened to fall that way as the players made their decisions and their actions. And at this certain point in the fight, he is the last one standing as he's just recovered this mystical item. And as he holds it aloft, that last ally of his falls at his feet. And you could have heard a pin drop as he howled. He just let out a howl. And the rest of the party was like, what's going on. I'm talking about he as a player. Kyle was howling. As we all fell silent, trying to get him to express what he said, he pointed his finger at me dead in the face and said, "You did this to me. How did you do this to me? How could this happen?" And I realized the prophecy that I gave him long ago, months ago, had just now come to fruition, just as he had found the weapon. And therefore, he perceived that I had been a genius and that I had put together the events to cause it to happen in just this way so that he would feel it. Now, he had had the weapon for several weeks. He had found it in an earlier adventure and had already had it with him. But at this moment, as he's considering his actions and he's, getting ready for the next round of combat, and his last ally collapses to the ground, in his mind, that was the moment that he allegedly raised the weapon in defiance and pride and all of that. He hadn't. That hadn't been his action at all. But the point is that we had created this vision of the future in such a fashion that he perceived that that was that prophecy. So now we go forward, and now granted, by this time I've already been playing for 25, 30 years, so moving to the modern era or whatever, I can now talk about how to utilize this concept of creative prophecy for your own group. And the first thing to realize is that you might have actually picked this up yourself if you are a reader and know anything of the history of persona, like the actual people like Nostradamus or Edgar Cayce and others who are even in modern times considered to be great prophets. So the things I'm going to be talking about here in a second, I'm pointing in the wrong direction. We talk about here in a moment are actually the same mechanical things with which you can see current day statements as prophecy as well. So let's start talking about them. The first one is a prophecy needs to be open-ended. In other words, if you're going to state that it's happening at a particular date, and that particular date comes and goes and it hasn't happened, the prophecy is now considered squashed and removed from play. If you know the history of things like the Heaven's Gate group down in San Diego and stuff, most religious organizations that believe in prophecy hold to this idea that we can know specific dates, and they base their faith, their structure on those. And those are dangerous because they are not open-ended. An open-ended prophecy can apply over and over again, as could be evidenced if you looked in the biblical reference of the book of Revelation or the book of Daniel. There's a difference between those, and we could go into that. There's an entire subject we could go into there. But just realize that in the case of the Revelation of John in the New Testament, it is a sealed prophecy. Therefore, it shouldn't be open-ended, and people shouldn't be trying to buy into interpretations. Whereas at the time of Daniel's prophecy, when he was recording it, it was a open-ended prophecy for down the future so that they would be able to evidence things. We'll go into that later. But the idea is that open-ended prophecy has no termination date. So it can happen now, it could happen in 300 years, it could happen in a millennia, it could happen whenever. It's considered to be a good prophecy if it can be made to fit, if the evidence that is currently around can be made to fit that prophecy. So an open-ended prophecy doesn't have a termination date. The next thing is that a creative prophecy, a really good creative prophecy, has to be narrowly interpreted. In other words, the person who is reading or accepting this prophecy has to be looking for it to happen in a specific way at a specific point and looking only for those triggers. If you have narrowly interpreted an open-ended prophecy, you're only going to see it when the narrow interpretation matches all of the facts. If the interpretation of the prophecy is open and can happen over and over again, it won't take long for people to debunk it as a prophecy, because if you're going to say the sun is going to rise on a Tuesday, well, it may happen on this Tuesday, and that'd be cool, but it'll also happen the following Tuesday and the following Tuesday after that, and so on. And so therefore its use as a prophecy goes out the window. So we need to narrowly interpret it. So particularly if you're formulating it for a specific games group, or in particular a player, it's really kind of handy because you can narrowly interpret it down to that person's perspective, and then all you have to do is give him the check marks later. The next is, once the prophecy has been stated, once it's out there in the public ear, so to speak, it needs to be constantly repeated. It has to be found in multiple sources. It has to be refreshed in their memory by other persons who have heard the prophecy. Even the players themselves, in the case of Kyle, everybody was reminding him that he was going to do this horrible thing, and of course he kept looking for it in every encounter. And because it was so narrowly focused, he never had a real problem with it. The next thing it needs to be, and I hate to say it this way, but it needs to be intentionally vague. When a prophecy is very, very narrowly interpretable and not vague, then it's almost impossible for you as the storyteller to make all of the evidences match. Since I spoke of his allies as fallen, I didn't specify whether they were dead, injured, unconscious. They all happened to be on the ground at the same time. It wasn't that they were unconscious or all dead. I didn't have it so narrowly defined that it couldn't happen more than once, but it had to be such a time that it would be up to him to make that final jump of interpretation. And therefore, by being intentionally vague, you're leaving enough wiggle room that you can adjust things as it goes into the scene. Had I known what was going on, it might have been more difficult, because I actually may have tried to fix things. But because I had left him a narrowly interpreted future projection that was difficult to repeat, the fact in terms of its action, but constantly be repeated in the story, it made it so that it was easy for him to fall prey to it. The next thing is, be surprisingly simple with your prophecies. It's going to rain is probably too simple, but the idea of saying there will be a bolt of lightning on the mountain on a day when this and such happens, then now you've got the random chance of a storm, or maybe a player character who's got lightning bolt. There's all kinds of ways that you can cause the fulfillment without revealing what you're doing. Now, does this mean I'm being capricious? No, I'm actually referring to a prophecy that will assist you in developing the character, the story, the events. The next is to make it 1 in a million. And what I mean by that is the opposite of what you think. Don't think that you have to be so good that you do it every time and you do it right every time. No. Make lots and lots of prophecies. Present lots and lots of curses. Produce lots and lots of people proclaiming what will or won't happen. Deathbed curses is a great one. I'll get you when the sun rises on the west. So there's all kinds of ways you can build out the prophecies so that any one of them, when it triggers, it's literally like a lottery ticket. Yes, you printed 1 million lottery tickets, but only one is a winner. But people buy tickets because they're hoping to get that one, even though they know there's 1 billion other ones that have been printed. So the idea of creating a useful and productive created prophecy, make sure you make a bunch of them so that any one of them that triggers makes you the prophet, makes you the amazing one. Now, since I've learned this method, my players run into prophecies considerably. They actually get written documents that include prophecies in them, and the players fulfill them. And when they fulfill them, wow, I'm a genius. Also, if you want a really good creative prophecy, make sure that it's deeply personal to the person you want to affect. Therefore, if you're aiming it at the entire group, make sure you call out the members so that in the prophecy, it will only be when they are in the complete configuration of this playing group. So therefore, it is not something that they could carry over to another group or hand off to another player and have him worry about it. Instead, it's got to be deeply personal. I tend to use them on an individual basis, and generally when I'm working with a player who either intentionally asked me for assistance in building towards a masterfully heroic life or whatever, or there's somebody who has a difficulty or a challenge within the party and I'm trying to assist them in reaching their objective by putting on them these onuses and prophecies that suggest that they will do bad things and bad things will happen, or they will do good things and good things will happen. But mainly you want to make it so that the players are the ones who pull the triggers and make the things happen for the prophecy to be completed. In this case, the self-fulfilling prophecy of standing over your friends with the weapon you intended to get in your hand as they fall. Now, I have to tell you the rest of the story before I go on. Kyle, as a young man, as I said, was rather wayward. As a matter of fact, after the fact, when I talked with Kyle years later, when he was in the Marine Corps, one of the conversations we had, he reflected back on the fact that had he not been a part of our games group and had he not developed that concept of that paladin, that he might have ended up dealing with street gangs and other things like that. Now, I'm not saying that role-playing solves all of that, but I am saying that here, when I tell you the rest of the story, you'll see why Kyle individually felt that it changed his life. Now, as I had mentioned, he's trying to become a paladin, and I had him create his own orders. The rituals, the pathway to his paladinship required him to do certain acts and certain conditions and all of that. And fulfilling that prophecy led him into that direction. So now, let's fast forward from his incident with the sword. 3 weeks. I walk into the games group, and they're shouting at each other. Now, they're all teenagers. Remember, this is my son's... Well, there were adults in the group too, but it was predominantly my son's group of friends. And they were at each other. They were just shouting and shouting. And I was getting frustrated with not being able to get everybody's attention. And I was in particular going to shout Kyle down because his voice was at that moment the loudest. Until I realized what he was shouting. And when I got that, everything changed. Kyle suddenly elevated himself in that one action, in my eyes, dramatically. Because what he was yelling in the face of all of his friends who were shouting at each other was temperance. You see, he had taken an oath within his paladin order that he would be the balance in all things. And when players were losing control, it was his character, this paladin, that was doing the shouting. It was not just Kyle making more noise. Instead, he was trying to draw the players back into the game by shouting one of his personal oath commands. And when I realized it, I just waited, and he quelled them all, and brought them all down by staying in character, explaining to them that this was their unruly behavior and that great and terrible things would happen because of it. And after all, don't forget, remember the prophecy that put me on this path. And personally, my heart swelled with pride because somebody got it. He understood. He was presenting the exact facts as I had hoped he might one day. But he was fulfilling the prophecy himself by becoming the very paladin. Ironically, he joined the Marine Corps, served our country faithfully for God knows how many years. I haven't seen the young man in probably better than 2 decades now, but he was a great friend of my son, and I remember that story in particular because it is the typification of what I call creative prophecy. The next one we're going to cover is Quantum Ogres. Now, I mentioned Quantum Ogres at the beginning and talked about how they worked, and I have to say there's pluses and minuses to the concept behind them. The element of it that is challenging is that if you build your adventures one at a time and you're only prepared for the players to go in that one direction, you will be finding yourself needing to run the concept of the Quantum Ogres all of the time. In my early iterations, when I was in the third or fourth iteration, which would have been 30 years ago, 35 years ago, it had dawned on me that my task as a game master had always up until that point to draw all the maps in all the directions and be prepared for the players to go off whichever direction and be able to resolve new encounters whichever direction they went. And so I actually had created a methodology for avoiding the Quantum Ogres by mapping out an entire world. Now, those of you that are world builders and storytellers will understand what I'm saying here, but I was at a point where literally anywhere that you were placed in the world of Nykos, I could tell you what was going on there, who was the local leaders, what the local governmental system was, who their allies were, who their enemies were, what major monstrosities lived in the area, what types of governments, what kinds of religions, and so on. But then I discovered a different way of thinking, and at that time it wasn't called Quantum Ogres, we called it Bubble Tech. And the idea was you build an adventure within a framework of a country or a locale. And you don't have a particular penchant for where you want to place it, because all you want to do is have these encounters engage with the players, right? So the bubble, therefore, would move. And it wasn't necessarily ever solid until a player engaged with it. So it was similar to the Quantum Ogres if you consider the Quantum Ogres to be Schrodinger's cat. Because once you know where they are, they no longer are malleable. They no longer move. So what this afforded is, therefore, I could write 4, 5, 6 adventures ahead, knowing that wherever they go, I can place this in front of them and it will solidify. And that will help me define and build out the world map. So it actually helped me to fill in the gaps by taking them down the path of wherever they went and solidifying it into a locale by locking in that bubble. Others call this concept the encounter juggling. And this is where you've got several encounters that you've teased in a variety of directions, and the players are never really quite sure until they start going. So encounter juggling, though, the biggest challenge with it especially is that it can be very effective if you're running multiple groups. Throughout my gaming career, most of the time I've been GMing 2 and 3 and 4 times a week, simply because I got used to doing it at that kind of a frequency, and I had different groups of players that wanted to play. I also moved a lot, as I've mentioned before, so there was a lot of cycle through of stories and players, and I wanted to kind of capture that as well. So by utilizing encounter juggling, I could have 3 or 4 of my bubble tech bubbles out there in the ether, and as the players would pick them, I could lock it into place for that adventure. But the same encounter could be used with a different group on a different day. The biggest challenge with encounter juggling is you have to be a decent jongleur. If you fumble a roll and you run the same encounter twice in a row, or you build a location from an encounter and then you find that it's already been established in a local area across the river, now you got a problem. So realize that encounter juggling does take even a more particular set of skills than utilizing bubble tech, because the bubbles, you simply either have them or you don't. But when you're running a series of adventures or a group of different campaigns, it's a little more difficult. Now, I have to say, the concept of a quantum ogre is highly seductive because it is a huge time-saving tool. Because if you spent 3 weeks building the adventure, you don't want it to go to waste. And that 3 weeks is an investment that's already been made in the game. So therefore, simply removing its location does save you a ton of time. But it's really only a short-term fix, because they still may go the direction that you had this adventure mapped for. So therefore, you're still going to have to build and all of that. So it doesn't save time in that fashion, but it is a short-term fix. Fundamentally, it's something that you can do when you have no other choice. Like, for example, I had, at one point, I was going to 2 or 3 weddings a month because I was in the military, and young guys seem to get that bug every spring, and then you've got 3 or 4 or 10 of your buddies in the Air Force or the Marine Corps that are, as a friend of mine called it, swearing in. And therefore, you're not always able to work on your projects. So it's a stopgap. You can say, okay, well, I can't work on Tuesday's event, but I do know I have that quantum ogre still sitting on out in the ether, and so therefore it does help to fix it, and it is kind of a stopgap. It does prevent a player group from being frustrated. But I really call the concept of the quantum ogres a form of preventable laziness. I'm not saying that in a negative way. I'm not trying to say that a game master is lazy because he uses the quantum ogres. But what I am saying is that if you have the time to build an encounter, build a series of events, feel free to do that, because the more you build, especially if you're a story builder and a world builder, the more you build, even if you don't use it in the place you intended, it's still lore that will become solidified once you have it placed. So don't let the ogres take over, but instead learn to use them, because it does give you an innovation opportunity, because there are times when you've written it for a temperate zone, but the adventure you're needing is actually in the Arctic. So now you have to revise what's going on, but you can revise something on the fly much more quickly than you can completely create it out of whole cloth. So just realize that a few quantum ogres sitting in the sidelines waiting to be used are a good thing, because they will eventually play out in your story and can be part of the solution. Alrighty. Before we continue, I do have to go back over here and do it's like a pledge drive. I've got to remind you to subscribe here on Twitch to get no commercials. If you're on YouTube, definitely subscribe there, because it helps to keep it a daily channel for you to subscribe, to like the video, follow us, everything. All the good bells and whistles there. And I just wanted to also mention that if you are interested in the lore of Nykos, you can check out NycosRPG.info, which is my World Anvil page. So it's got a bunch of uncategorized lore. You can go and pick through the materials there. I am a big believer in R&D. Yes, it's research and development, but it's also rob and duplicate. So if there's something that you like in the world that you've seen that is mine, feel free to go ahead and use it in your lore. Just make sure you brand it and colorize it, so to speak, for your own adventures. Alrighty, so now we go back. And we move on from category 2 down to category 3. Dice honesty policy. Now, if you notice, I didn't put any text up here, and that's because this is a dicey subject. Yes, the pun was intended. When you are dealing with the outcomes of situations that you put into place, then you have to be ready to handle whatever comes from that. I do have players, pardon me for a second. I do have players that come from what I call crunchy roleplay games. They come from Pathfinder, they come from Dungeons and Dragons 3rd edition, 3.5, or even bigger ones like RQ. They come from these combat systems that are absolutely dependent upon successes. If you've played a traditional roleplay game, you know that missing is a horrible thing in a roleplay game, and it deprives you of actions for the turn and can be really problematic. And so there has been over years a penchant for the die rolling community to fudge their dice rolls. I'm not saying that they do it every time, although I do know players who do, The biggest challenge is if you are a good game master, you have to figure out methodologies so that your players do not feel like they're under the gun, that they're under the microscope, that you are going to be checking on them. So in the world of NycosRPG, for example, one of the best elements of that game is that the quality of your success, how far up the scale or down the scale your die roll is, impacts the outcome of the narrative of the scene. And therefore, players become excited about the die rolls and they want others to see what those values were because it shows prowess, it shows skill, it shows their success like nobody's business. So one of the things that we instituted in NycosRPG in open play is that all dice rolls have to be substantiated by another set of eyes. Now we don't do it as a mandate, but what we do is, for example, I'll be rolling my combat rolls for the villains, and I roll my percentage dice for the attack, and then I have a player observe that dice roll, and so that way there's no question on whether or not I've gotten to the level of success or failure that I've described, so that when the players respond, their dice rolls can be challenged equitably, because if it's good enough for the goose, it's good enough for the ganders. And so therefore it's important for the players to know that you're accountable to the same level of dice honesty as them. Secondly, because NycosRPG really rewards the extreme success, extreme end of the spectrums, extreme successes, extreme failures, it becomes part of the cinema, part of the action sequence for the players to actually be watching as the dice roll. So it helps to, it helps to affect dice honesty policy. Now let me go with a couple of examples of why this is desirable, even though I didn't build a list here. Main reason why dice honesty is the best policy is that even the bad rolls in a role-playing game help to develop story. Yes, you critically fumbled, and therefore you accidentally threw your sword across the floor. Roll a dice to see where it landed. Now you got to go get it, and the bad guys might get to it. Yes, there's some drama that can come directly from the die rolling. But beyond that, there are a lot of players who deprive themselves of the true joy of a role-playing game by cheating the dice for themselves, and you're only letting them harm themselves. Because it's a game. No one's going to be taking them to dice jail because they failed to roll honesty. But what they have done is they've made it so that the successes that they do get are downgraded in comparison, because several times they called it. It's what's the current term for it? Stolen honor. If you are playing a role-play game and you are expected to be rolling honestly, and you're throwing away stolen valor, that's the word, stolen valor. So you're claiming to have gotten a perfect die roll when you didn't. Later, when you do roll it, it doesn't have the same impact because, well, you're getting them all the time. So I've had players where the stolen valor argument ended up being the actual way I was able to convince them to roll in the open, because, you know, if you've rolled 3 18s in a row, I'd love to have seen them. Don't you think it would be cool to be able to see the person who rolled 3 18s in a row? Great. So make sure you leave the dice out and let somebody else check them. It's not a bad thing, but it does provide a level of gravitas to the actual successes. In the same fashion, if a dice mechanism requires you to always roll a high number, and the game master has allowed you to build modifiers to the point where you can't fail, what fun is there then? You as the player might as well write the story now, because you're never going to fail again, and there's no way that the game itself can rectify that. For this reason, Nykos does include the concept of a absolute success and an absolute failure, so that at least one time out of 100 things will actually go exactly like you want. One time in 100 things were going to go exactly the worst that could happen. And that's okay, because that's just the mechanics of a die rolling mechanism. If you put that in there, it's got to happen sometimes. If your dice mechanism doesn't give your players that equity, which leads to the rule of 8. We will talk about that in a later video. I've talked about it before, but the rule of 8 is really effective, especially in any system that utilizes D20 mechanisms. But we'll talk about that later. Let's move on. Next topic. Ooh, I forgot to shut the topic off. Topic 4. Near and dear to my heart. Absolute relativity. When you think of the term absolute, it means absolute means there's no other. It is the single thing. When you think of relativity, it's all relative. If I'm moving and you're moving, we move past each other. Each of us is doing the speed of light. How fast are we going between us? We have to be going only the speed of light, because that's the way light speed works, right? So realize, therefore, in that specific instance, the very facts themselves are temporal. The fact of your velocity in that direction is absolute. You know what your fact is. But that fact is still relative, because if I'm moving in the opposite direction, the difference becomes the speed of light. I know there's all kinds of fun stuff there, and don't get me started on whether our world is real, because I know that there have been physicists that have, in theory, proven that everything is unreal and this is all an imagination. And while I would technically agree with that on a completely different issue, cough, cough, Christianity, but the fact that the facts can be temporal and modified over time by the actions of groups, that's, to me, that's really important. It helps with the idea of absolute relativity. Now, do remember that I do also believe that there are immutable truths. There are things that simply are. If you are playing the character nobody else is, I'm certainly not. The other people at the table aren't. It's on you. So therefore, it's immutable that that's your character, that you are playing them. And that is not going to change while you're sitting in the chair. But add to that the fact that human memory in particular, and I'm not sure if it's true of all memory, but at least human memory is fallible. As a matter of fact, they've proven that our beliefs about the past become more and more malleable as time goes by, because we're more than willing to change the things that didn't go the way we'd like to, and therefore the idea of how they happened becomes itself a mutable subject, and therefore our memory is fallible. It can actually be fooled all day long. Beyond that, if you're in an adventuring group and you've got other players at the table, you know that players are forgetful. They don't even necessarily remember where they put their dice from last Tuesday. There's one right there on the table that was here last week. But the reality is the players are not going to remember details from last week, 12 weeks ago, or in my case, 47 years ago. So therefore, because the facts are temporal, memory is fallible, and the players are forgetful, that means that the elements, even the critical elements of the story, have to be malleable. They have to be adjustable. You have to be able to go with the flow with what the characters do remember and what they are acting upon, even if that is not the memory you have of it or whatever. So just realize that all of those pieces really come down to the issue that when we talk about absolute relativity, the hammer law, right? Rule 1. The game master's always right. No, that's not a hammer law, but the idea is that because of that, and because of the malleable nature of the story, and the fact that the facts can be changed by time, and our memories are all faulty, it is absolutely forgivable to provide a retcon. I know there are people that aren't even sure what a retcon is, but the idea that a story that you've told as fact now has to be modified because of some new evidence that wasn't available before, and therefore you have to change the story. Oh, you were an only child? but we just now determined that that guy is your brother. Surprise, surprise, he's your brother. Why? Because the story had built it, and we're going with it. And therefore, even if you didn't have a brother before, you do now because it's part of the fabric of the story. And generally speaking, and this is, it's not so broad a generalization you might think, but generally speaking, players won't balk at a retcon. As a matter of fact, they look forward to it and forgive it when it happens because they know that there, by the grace of God, go I. It might be my neck on the noose next time. So if that fact had to change, yeah, that's the way I remember it too. Yeah, that's definitely. It wasn't, but it is now. So the idea, therefore, of a player's activity and understandability in the game is itself absolutely relative. So now I'm running out of time, so I got to get on to this final subject. And this one is, I think, arguably the best of these. And that is develop an active perception filter. And this is a skill. This is literally something that I would be following on my character sheet if I had a persona sheet for who I am right now. My active perception filter score is probably in the 70s, and I would be aiming at the 90s. The idea of an active perception filter is the abilities that you have and develop as a game master to adjust and alter the story instantaneously in full form on the fly. And it comes from these skills or attributes. First of all, you have to learn to watch micro expressions. People don't always reveal everything on their faces, but they all do for a moment. And so if you can learn to see those moments of disdain, distress, anger, joy, surprise, when you learn to read those, you will be a far better game master. As a matter of fact, there are a lot of professional behaviorists out there, behavioral arts specialists who do this. I listen to a guy named Spidey all the time. I highly recommend him. At some point, I'm going to petition for an endorsement for him because he is amazing. But I also recommend a TV show called Lie to Me. I think right now it's on Tubi. And Lie to Me is a series with Tim Roth as a behaviorist specialist who works to help people solve crimes by reading people and being able to determine not whether they're lying or not, but whether or not they are creating a series of tells, micro expressions that indicate what their mindset is. Great show. Okay, next is listen for verbal cues. If a player tells you, I'm not interested in something, they maybe aren't interested in it, but then again, they might be, so listen to the way they say it. I'm not convinced. There might be evidence, but I maybe not now. So all of the words that people use give you more information than just the actual answer to a question. So listen for verbal cues. They'll come from your players. They'll come from the other people at the table. This also works outside of game when the players are talking with each other about the campaign. So listen even then, because there are going to be things they're going to be reflecting on or focusing on that you can tell are things they want to include in the story, but don't either have the courage to ask or haven't figured out how yet to do so. The next one's rather large, but it's also a skill, and that is reading the room. If a player is having a problem or a challenge, figure out ways to address that challenge without drawing too much attention to it or whatever. Figure out how best to handle the situation, and reading the room is a great skill. As a matter of fact, it's a NycosRPG skill for those of you that haven't got all of your skills picked out yet. Cough, cough, Gumby, cough, cough. The next part of your active perception filters is already built in pre-planning for alternatives. So if a player is having a challenge and you're wanting to work around it, figure out ways to get the clue to them if they're not getting it from the puzzle. There are so many different ways that you can convey information that it doesn't have to be rules as written. I'm looking around because the rules as written avatars might come and punch me in the nose. But the idea is that By pre-planning alternatives, you give yourself an out, and leaving yourself an out is just as critical in role-playing games mastery as driving a delivery truck. Not that I haven't done that before either, but the next thing to mention is you want to pay attention to the white space. I think I've talked about this before. It was either Marvin Gaye or one of that lot that said, no, I'm trying to think of who it was. Maybe it was Marvin Gaye. Said that it's as important to play the spaces as it is to play the notes. And the reality here is that the white space in a game can tell you loads. If you're giving a description and people start snoring, there may be time for less narrative. If the information you're giving them causes several of them to gasp at the same time, focus on that and remember that later on, because that whatever that piece was they triggered on is going to be useful to you later in the story. And by paying attention to the white spaces, you're also able to tell when players are checking out. This happens often when they already have figured out something and then it doesn't go the way they thought. Then all of a sudden they backtrack, doubt themselves, and start regressing in their story development. And it's really important to recognize those white spaces, those lulls in the action, so you can fix them, turning the lulls into lulls. But that's another pun. All right. Next is be deliberate, but also be patient. So if you've determined that the only way for them to get a clue is in this puzzle, feel free to give recommendations, hints, whatever. But don't expect them to solve it in the same time frame that you took to design it. Maybe you were particularly clever and it came through in an instant, and so now you're providing it to the players. Be patient with them, because they may choose a course that doesn't match yours, and that means you have to find your own way to adjust it. And then finally, this is a weird one, but I recommend taking classes in public speaking. One of the greatest challenges that a game master can face is not having the players' attention and being able to captivate an audience. By developing public speaking skills, you get rid of a lot of the verbal pauses. Now, I recognize that when I'm doing these videos, I'm speaking in a narrative form, and I'm speaking to people that I haven't seen before, and I don't even know that you're in the audience right now. But the lessons that I learned in public speaking does mean that I think before I speak. I do utilize my own white spaces in doing presentations. And while I didn't say it here, because this is talking about the perception side of the angle, on the active presentation side of the house, you also have to learn to use the white spaces and verbal pauses and intentional absences to build interest, to build curiosity, and we'll go into that in a later video. But the idea here is that your active perception filter is how you become agile. How do you become able to adapt? For example, knowing when to slide that quantum ogre into place because they're going in a way you don't want to go and you haven't got the map done. Intellectually knowing, okay, this is where I'm going to place that ogre that I've already got drawn up in the back. Great way to buy yourself time for the advancing on whatever target that the players have chosen, since it wasn't necessary in your plan. Wow, I covered a lot of stuff and did it in a little less than an hour, so I'm pretty proud of myself. So, as a quick reminder, I'll go back here again, and I do that every time. Don't forget to subscribe to NycosRPG everywhere. So at NycosRPG on YouTube, at NycosRPG, Twitch, at NycosRPG on Twitter, Twitch, X. I said it wrong again. X, and also on Instagram. I will be building out the rest of my social media acumen over time. I do use the excuse that I'm an old guy. Remember 50 years of game mastering, which means only 11 years beyond that, and I didn't exist. So that's a long time to be in the world, and I've got a lot of catching up to do. If you guys are interested in being able to be part of the community, do check out check out patreon.com/Nykos. You don't have to add the RPG. It's just /Nikos. And you can become part of our community. If you do so, that gives you access to our Discord channel. And we have 2 games that are Patreon supporters only. So it gives you a great opportunity to get your toes wet utilizing the NycosRPG system no matter where you are in the world. Alrighty, we are done with what we needed to do today. I want to thank you for being here and being a part of this. And I hope to see you again. Now remember, we do record episodes at 10 a.m. Pacific and 11 p.m. Pacific, Monday through Friday. We will probably be adding a Saturday and Sunday episode coming up in the near future, simply because I can't stay away from you guys very long, because I really want to help expand the world of role-playing to go along with the idea of integrating a greater innovation, creation, and joy in the world, to use a currently local political phrase. Alrighty, well, I'm Jonathan Albin. I am NycosRPG, and I will see you again next time. Thanks again for being here with